Welcome to the Peace Catalyst podcast, where we share stories to inspire, uplift, and encourage you in your peacemaking journey. I'm Becca Tyvel, and I work with Peace Catalyst International, normally in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm currently joining you all from Pretoria, South Africa, actually, where I'm working remotely and hopefully engaging in peace building locally as well. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Allie Burnison.
I'm Allie Burnison, and I am in the LA area doing peace building work here, and I wish I was in South Africa. By the way, if you enjoy the Peace Catalyst podcast, please do us a favor and take some time to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It really helps boost our visibility and encourages others to give us a listen.
Yeah, thank you guys for doing that. And Allie, I wish you could also be in South Africa because it's amazing so far, but it's really important that you are in LA because you have a really cool event coming up, which is...
Yes. Yeah. So I have an event on Sunday, which by the time you're listening to this, probably it will be over and hopefully it went successfully. But one of our partners with PCI, Dr. Salim Munayyer from Israel Palestine, is coming from Jerusalem, and he's speaking here in Pasadena, California on reconciliation efforts in Israel Palestine. He's had years and years of experience doing this kind of work. So he is basically just going to take some time to share what he's learned and the model of reconciliation that he uses, challenges, successes, all of a little bit of the context working in Israel Palestine for peace between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. I hope people can take something away from the experience as well as, connecting with each other and kind of getting to know each other better. But take away, that if relationship can be built and some sort of reconciliation be achieved, even though it's like, a long process with a lot of hard work in Israel Palestine, which I think is like a conflict that we think of as so intractable, where there's absolutely no hope for peace or reconciliation, whatever that means, then can't it happen here in our own country, in our own context, in our own communities, families, across political divides, as we're going to be talking about in this episode. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my hope for the event, but
yeah. That sounds amazing. And yeah, I really wish I could attend it in person. But yeah, Dr. Salim Munayyer is so inspirational. And I think, like you're saying, there's so much power in that people-to-people peacemaking and reconciliation, like at the relational level, is really crucial. And such a beautiful thing.
And you actually spoke to him on this podcast before I was part of the podcast. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you definitely should.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great idea to listen to that episode because he kind of gives the whole model of reconciliation that they use. So, every episode we've been sharing peace quotes, and our peace quote this episode is from the late Representative John Lewis. It says, "Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself." And as part of our Becoming the Beloved Community series, restoration and healing in the midst of division is very relevant to that concept of reconciling people who are in entrenched divisions. Basically the concept of this series is rooted in the historical origin of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. And so we're kind of framing our conversations around that. And we're talking to people whom we call peace builders, who are involving themselves in the ministry of reconciliation, who are interrupting and challenging oppression, and ultimately holding firmly to a vision of justice, restoration, peace, and healing for all members of a community.
So this week, we're continuing the series with an interview with Julie Ethan. And Julie is an author, a speaker, a peacemaker, someone who's pursuing conflict resolution through the power of story. Julie grew up in Minnesota, where she eventually got married and grew her family. And she and her husband eventually formed friendships with political opposites there in Minnesota. And through these friendships, she learned the power of empathy and connecting with those who think and believe differently from ourselves. She gives us a full account of what this process of building these friendships looked like in her book, How Can Half the Country Be So Stupid? A memoir and guide to friendship between political opposites. Julie has a master's in peace and justice studies from the University of San Diego, and she and her husband Larry currently live in San Diego.
Can't wait to talk to her.
Well, hello, Julie. I am so excited to have this conversation with you. Would you mind, just to get us started, introducing yourself to our audience, sharing a bit about who you are, where you're coming from, and yeah, we'll just start the conversation there.
Sure. Thank you, Allie. Thank you for having me on the show. So I became very interested in the polarization of our politics probably back in 2012. And it had been sort of a part of my learning journey. At midlife, I went back to school and got a master's degree in peace and justice studies from the University of San Diego. And then started to figure out how to pair all of those conflict resolution skills with the political landscape, which just kept, honestly, in my opinion, ramping up and getting worse, from 2012 forward. And whenever the pandemic hit and I was unemployed, I had the opportunity to write a small memoir about my friendship with a political opposite and try to bring some of those conflict resolution principles to life through story. And hopefully the story would touch people and they would get ideas on how they could deal with their family and friends, because that just seems to be a big issue these days. It's become kind of cliche about Thanksgiving,
Right.
but gathering with family that has different opinions. So that's kind of a background.
Right. So, yeah, no, you're so right. It has become a cliche of like SNL skits every year about Thanksgiving, and all of the drama that can ensue. So you wrote this memoir, which is called How Can Half the Country Be So Stupid?
Exactly.
Right. And yeah, would you mind describing that relationship that you reflect upon in the book? Who were these people who you found were your political opposites? And if you would mind sharing a bit about that.
Sure. So most of my young adult life was spent in evangelical circles. We were conservative politically. A lot of that was, centered around the pro-life issue, which I think a lot of people can relate to that. But our dear friends, Beth and Benjamin, they were a mixed race couple. Benjamin was Black, and my husband and I are both white. And we would get together and hang out and have such a good time. But the interesting thing is that what was going on in our sort of separate lives from our friendship was very, very different. For example, Benjamin and Beth were involved in Democratic politics. Benjamin was involved in a lot of civil rights activities. And Larry and I were involved in church and possibly teaching Sunday school to kids or this and that kind of thing. And so it wasn't really until I went back to school in 2010 to actually a conservative university in Minnesota, Bethel University, that I started to learn about, worldviews and differences in worldviews. And then we had an assignment. And that's what's so cool about your series on the beloved community, is that we had an assignment to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. which I had never read in my life. And here I am, 45 years old, reading this for the first time. And I think what it did for me is that he's very vivid in the letter when he describes, for example, what it feels like to be a parent who has to tell their child who sees a commercial on TV about an amusement park that they can't go to the amusement park because of the color of their skin. And I am the mother of 5 children. That hit me really hard. I think it brought the reality of the civil rights struggle just right into my living room, right in front of my face, because I just grew up in fairly white Minnesota and really didn't know a lot about the whole civil rights struggle or the Jim Crow laws or any of that. So when I read that letter, and this is in the book, I immediately called Benjamin and I'm like, Benjamin, I just read the letter from a Birmingham jail, and I just want you to know that from now on, I am going to march by your side at the Martin Luther King parade on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And he was just really calm. He's like, sounds good. You know, as a matter of fact, I'll get us tickets to the breakfast. And it was a turning point, I have to say, from that point forward. Just, it's sort of like, well, now these days we call it being woke, but you know, it really was an awakening. It was like finally seeing something that I had very little information on. So I think sometimes we have to forgive people because they just don't have the information. But B, I could relate to because I was a parent, and it touched my heart, you know. So that was the sort of the kickoff to a new turn in the relationship, where we started sort of sharing a little bit more about politics with each other. And one day Benjamin asked me, do you think there's anything that we could agree on politically? And I said, well, that's interesting. So we started sort of going through a list of things. And something that we both ended up agreeing on was that the immigration problem in the United States was a mess, and something needed to be done about it, you know. And I was coming at it as a small employer, dealing with undocumented people wanting jobs, and morally, how was I supposed to deal with that? And then he was coming at it from more of a big union perspective, and, you know, the fact that they knew something needed to be done about immigration. And so that sort of became a connecting point for us. And then it just kind of moved forward from there. And I just feel like I just started to educate myself more on the issues.
Wow. That I thank you so much for sharing that. I think, yeah, you highlight something that I've experienced myself in a different context, with just recognizing the need in my own personal burden for interfaith relationship building and collaboration, and how that all began for me with a personal encounter and a friendship with a Muslim boy. And so I think your ability to connect the words in the letter that you're reading, you know, so many years apart from when the letter was written, and it's touching you in this moment, you know, and you're connecting it to your experience with your kids, and it becomes personal, and how that, like, how that experience shifts your disposition towards, you know, a whole host of issues and transforms your relationship. That is just so interesting to me. And I mean, anecdotally, I feel like that's how it happens for many people. A shift in mindset comes through an experience, a relationship, when it becomes personal. So yeah, thank you.
I agree. I think as peacemakers, we often want to see a big shift. We want to have a big impact, and a whole bunch of people change their minds all at once. But in reality, it's just like those one-on-one, you know, small relationships that change people. And honestly, my transformation to being willing to look more and more at the liberal side of politics probably took 10 years of that relationship. So a lot of people think, oh, that's too long, that's not worth it. But I mean, is it? Because everything is like a ripple effect, you know?
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, you're so right about wanting big transformative change, but it always starts small. Yeah. Um, so many questions are coming up. So many things that I want to talk about more. But I think first of all, just to back up and look at our country and where we find ourselves now, and um, you said at the beginning that you kind of began in 2012 and you were already noticing, this increasing divide between two very polarized Americas, honestly. So if you wouldn't mind, from your perspective, like how have we gotten here? How did we get to where we are now, where where communities are fairly insular, and it feels like there are only there are just two groups, and like where's the middle? Yeah, which may or may not be true, but yeah, how do you think we got here, wherever here is, from your perspective?
Wherever, right. I just think it's so embedded in human nature to divide ourselves into sides. I think the us versus them mentality is a framework that we are clearly born into. I mean, if we want to even take a shot at organized religion, what my own religion taught me when I was growing up as a Catholic was that we were the ones that probably had a ticket into heaven, and everyone else probably didn't, or there was a waiting place for them or things like that. So we immediately start out with these notions of, there's some people that have it right, and then there's some people that have it wrong. And I think what happened with politics has a lot to do with, the divide was always there. I just don't think it was quite as vicious. I think the viciousness possibly came from mass communication, new technology, Facebook opening up to adults in 2009 or whatever year, because you can definitely see that it was ramping up through the 2000s. Or at least it felt closer to home for a lot of us. And, then it just came to the point where it's like, well, choose your side, well, what's my side? Well, how about this, and as long as it's sort of aligned with something we wanted to believe, it, it became true. I guess that's where I would start, is this whole notion of us versus them. And then taking that a little further into the conservative side that I was a part of, wanted the government to do certain things, but then not do certain other things. So we saw the government as some entity that, if as long as it aided the market and capitalism, then it was okay, and then protected us from outside forces. The other side saw the government's role as much larger and much more foundational in providing, education for the masses, and safety nets for poverty, and also environmental things. So what I began to see is that, interestingly, in the conservative tribe or group, they included, we didn't even see wealthy people as anything other than us. They weren't the 1%. We saw wealthy people as in our group, and we also saw corporations in our group, because those corporations provided our jobs. The liberal side saw, people in their group, but not, the wealthy or the corporations, but they more saw the government as in their tribe, in a sense. And so then the media was able to take those divisions and who we see as our in-group or our tribe, and then just really exploit them and get people really angry at each other. Right. and then it just exploded from there. I mean, I don't know about you. You're probably a decade or two or three younger than me, but like, what was it like for you growing up in the 2000s? Did you see a ramping up of division?
Yeah, it's so I am 26, so I was born in 1995. So I feel like perhaps when things were beginning to ramp up, I was, fairly young and not super engaged in these kinds of conversations. I would kind of go silent around the dinner table. But I do remember that. So I grew up on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, and I went to a Southern Baptist church. And my family leans conservative for sure. There has been some movement with various people. But at that time, I do remember thinking, or it was clear to me at that time that there is a right way to think and there is a wrong way to think. And even though I didn't have much to contribute in conversation when, various family members were kind of like bashing the concept of a big government and how, that's, as you're talking about, it's like not the government's role. They do these things and not those things. And that's like, this is the right perspective. And not only is it the right perspective, but it was arguments were very much tied to faith and tied to like religious convictions, which then I think makes it even more hairy to think for yourself as you're growing up. If you're, kind of forming your own faith, but also it's very much attached to your family's faith and expression of, for me, Christianity, evangelicalism, well, Southern Baptist. Yeah. But, so I think it becomes even more difficult to begin to think about like political issues if you're raised to see believing certain things as very much tied to like a right expression of faith. So I would say it wasn't until I came out to California for college that I began to see kind of another perspective that could also be like an authentically Christian perspective. I think growing up, it was very confusing. It's very confusing.
Well, it was really turbulent times to be growing up. I mean, it was, 9/11, occurs. You're still young, but it shakes up the whole country. And then the huge recession, and that disrupted a lot of families' lives. A lot of people lost their homes, and now here we are with this giant pandemic that does not seem to want to go away. And those are the types of crises where people start to draw lines. And you know what? I had a beautiful Southern Baptist older cousin that used to say that bad things can either make you bitter or better. And I think a lot of us have allowed ourselves to go to the bitter, in some of this stuff.
Yeah.
And we sort of do have to reimagine what would the better look like, because it's super easy to say, let's all be kumbaya, let's take care of the poor, as long as we all are in the same faith community and we're all believing the same thing, but a democracy is not that. It is an experiment in bringing together very diverse groups of people with very different beliefs. And can we govern all of them and make it work? And I think that, that is the big challenge that we're facing right now is, we either prove that we can make democracy work, or we go back into our little tribes, and wall ourselves off from everyone else. Right. And I don't really think that we want to do that. I think we have a bigger curiosity. Right. We have a bigger love.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You're bringing up this concept of tribes, which I would love to dive into a little deeper. In your book, if I can just quote, you say, and yet tribes still manage to have good relations, build alliances, and share resources. We must not forget that throughout history, tribes have depended on each other to thrive. And those lines just stuck out to me because I think it gets to what you were just saying, you know, that the concept of mutual flourishing, and we do depend on each other, even if we're coming from different worldviews and perspectives. But backing up a bit, what exactly do you mean when you talk about the concept of tribes? And yeah, we'll start there.
Yeah, well, in the book, I was clearly saying that we have the two tribes. I'm going to call them the blue team, which is the liberal side, and the red team, which is the conservative side. So mostly focusing on that form of political tribalism. The quote about how tribes can cooperate, honestly, that came from Benjamin. He contributed those thoughts. So I have to give him credit for that. But I will say, in addition, that when I was at the University of San Diego studying basically war, we called it peace and justice, but we were really dissecting wars. One of the big takeaways from that study was that we don't go to war with people we trade with. So our country is not at war with trade partners. We trade, I think Mexico is our biggest trade partner, clearly the European Union countries. You don't see us going to war with France or Great Britain or, and so right there, that sort of lets you know that establishing some sort of, maybe you could call it an economic bridge or link, is one step in creating conditions where we're at least going to try to figure out how to work things out, because now we are trading with each other. So I don't know if that brings some clarity, to the thought there, but it's something that we could build on, maybe, in terms of thinking of political tribalism.
Right. Yeah, that is a helpful framework. So do you think that with our natural instinct to team up with, well, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but to kind of team up with a group of like-minded individuals, to kind of find, to find a home in those places, if that's kind of what we're naturally inclined to do, you also mention in the book that working within these tribes, we can either, kind of cooperate and build bridges, or we can kind of burn them, I guess. Do you think that, from your perspective, that we are more inclined to do one rather than the other? And I guess that question is kind of more like psychological, but or maybe it depends on, context and environment. I think maybe right now, when there is a bit of fear and anxiety surrounding, pick an issue, with the pandemic, like maybe in that kind of context or environment, we're more likely to cling to our tribes, and then we don't necessarily want to build bridges. We're more inclined to burn them. But I don't know. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, in terms of what are we more naturally inclined to do? I think it's kind of obvious to all of us. We're naturally inclined to feel more comfortable in our own social bubble. But what I have seen that will jar people out of those bubbles is a lot of times a crisis, but something where they have to come together. So let's say a tornado comes through your community, and you have to pull together a soup kitchen and supplies for everyone. You're going to end up having conservatives, liberals, everyone working together for one common cause. And I think maybe we need to manufacture more situations where we bring everyone together to do some good. Because I think that the moment you get in a room where you actually start talking to someone who maybe has opposite beliefs, but you're doing something, in love, and you're trying to, execute this plan or whatever, it brings forward that opportunity to actually listen and hear what they have to say, and try to understand where they're coming from, And maybe you don't agree with their approach, but you might find out, and I talk a lot about this kind of thing in the book, like if you're a listener, if you can get really curious, you'll find out that you probably share a common value with that person, like maybe just a caregiving, charitable vibe when something goes wrong, or maybe you share the vibe of fairness or whatever. But you can find a value usually that you actually share with that person. You just have two completely different ways of getting to the end point.
Right. That is such a good suggestion, though. Listening for what values are kind of underlying the statements and seeing if there's some common ground there. And yeah, now that we're kind of moving into the practical and just thinking about, I'm thinking about relationships in my life where I know the divide is great between perspectives. So I know in the past you've utilized your own experience and studies to kind of help people within your own community through political counseling to kind of help, maybe provide tools and support for people who are in relationship with someone who's a political opposite. So I want to hear about your experience there. But then, yeah, also just kind of generally, like, is it always possible to build bridges with someone who's on the other side of the spectrum? Or, I mean, does it require both parties a certain level of willingness from both parties, or do you think it's most often possible to come to some sort of, and I don't even know how you would qualify or describe what you're aiming towards, what the goal is, but I guess if it's consensus, or I don't know how you would say it in your language, but is it always possible? And also, can you describe the political counseling?
Sure. I started out in 2017 after the election of Donald Trump, with the opportunity to facilitate some workshops or learn how to facilitate some workshops through the Braver Angels organization. And I highly recommend everyone look into Braver Angels. Their main mission is to depolarize America. And they do it in a very sort of marriage and family counseling methodology. And so I started out giving those workshops, which is where I learned a lot of the tools, and then from there ended up writing the book and doing some one-on-one counseling with people. It's more like a counseling in terms of conflict management. But like, more to your point, like, do both people have to be willing to sort of engage in the tools of this if they're on opposite sides? I mean, I would say that in reality, in most cases, we are confronted with a family member or a friend that has different beliefs, and it's just in the moment. You're not like sitting down to have some, like, let's have an agreement about trying to work through this issue together, and here's the tools we're going to use. So I think it just starts with those encounters. The biggest, most counterintuitive thing that you can do is just take a deep breath and take a step back and not immediately respond to what they're saying with your own correction or debatable point, and instead respond with another question. Ask them to go a little deeper so that it gives you time to listen, to practice that curiosity, and sort of to, like, instead of building your debate in your mind, you can take that step back and be thinking, now, I might not agree with what they're saying, but what am I hearing values wise? Where might we share something? And then, at the end of what they say, you might say, well, it sounds like we both care about this situation, about immigrants, or we both care about women. But I just take a different approach, and then you can take that a step further. Are you interested in hearing my thoughts? And see if they are. Sometimes we don't ask permission. We just blast people with what we think. But that's because all of these things, like I said, are very counterintuitive to our natural reactions, and they do take practice.
Mm.
um, and then the other thing is just recognizing when you just really need to drop the conversation, walk away from the talking points. You can always tell when things are escalating for someone and they're not gonna be able to listen, and just use a little humor. Well, we're not going to solve that problem today, are we? And then change the topic, you know?
Mm.
So that's another like little tool that you can use. A lot of times getting another person, if you're close enough to them to laugh with you, laugh at you, laugh at themselves, I think humor is a great tool. And I don't know, but then there's those, I know people are in the deeper family relationships where it's like you do have to deal with that person often. And what do you do if, they're constantly, bringing these things up? And I had that situation with a close family member where I just had to say, I care about you more than I care about this conversation. And I'm not going to go there. And they kept pressing and pressing and pressing. I'm like, I just had to start repeating it over and over like a mantra. I care about you more than I care about this conversation. And that's kind of why I've made my motto, relationships over politics. Because, at the end of the day, is it really worth it to burn that bridge or to burn down that relationship, over an opinion or a belief? That's what I guess we have to ask ourselves. So I don't know. How have you seen that play out in your social circles? Do you have people that disagree?
Definitely. Yeah. I can think of a handful of conversations where recently, just around the holidays, where there have been moments of pretty significant disagreement, and I tend to have the response of just shutting down and wanting to kind of run away from the conversation. And I think I might be moving slightly away from that, but definitely in the past, because when it gets into that like debatey zone, just being younger and usually talking to older family members, I'm thinking about family specifically, not as much in friendships for me, but I'm just like, well, they probably know more, they're more experienced, I'm no expert. And so then, just kind of like shut down. And I don't think that, I appreciate what you're saying about valuing the relationship over the issue, and knowing when to kind of steer away. I don't think that a practice of like peacemaking or peace building in these situations would be, one party feeling silenced and feeling like, they like there's no space for them in the conversation because they, for whatever reason. But I think there does need to be a certain level of discernment, especially if you're in a conversation where, or I guess I can only speak from my experience, if I've been in a conversation where I'm feeling a bit unsafe or just feeling like it's, the other person is getting combative and there will be no resolution or no sort of dialogue, even not even like we have to agree in the end, then I think there is probably a healthy way to steer the conversation. So that's what comes to mind when you were sharing.
And I think it's important, like, especially as a young person, to, like you said, not feel like, well, I just have to drop this. So I think, something that might be useful again is just acknowledging what the person says and then just saying, I have a different thought on how that should be approached, and then of course it's up to that person to invite you into further conversation and be an adult about it, I guess.
Right.
But Yeah, I mean, it's not fair if you feel sort of shut out, or if one opinion is ruling the room and everyone else who disagrees is just sitting there being quiet. Unfortunately, I feel like that's where we've put ourselves right now, and we do need to climb out of this.
Yeah.
That's why we just need to talk about it more. It's
Right.
not fair, really.
Right.
It's
Yeah, no, absolutely. It doesn't feel fair. I'm wondering, like, what you think about navigating conversations where, our politics are very personal, and definitely around certain issues where issues or certain positions are like closely tied to either religious convictions or moral. Does it become just, and this might be an obvious question, probably, but I'm curious about your thoughts. Like, does it just become increasingly difficult as the as those issues are like closely held? Like, if we're emotionally or morally or religiously attached to an issue, does it just become more difficult to have conversations with somebody who's coming from the other side or a different perspective?
I mean, I guess the obvious answer is yes, of course. But you just never know what it's going to be that might, put a chink in the armor or change someone's mind. I remember a really long time ago, holding a certain position about sexuality in our society, and then reading an article in a magazine about some of the science behind um, embryos and hormones that are involved and things that they do. Um, and it was basically explaining why you could have these different sexual orientations or different, gender orientations. And coming from a biology background, because my first vocation was a nurse, the article, made complete sense to me, and it opened my eyes. And I don't know that I'm really answering your question, but I guess what I would say is that people are going to hold their closely held beliefs until they're ready, or if something comes across their path that challenges that belief. And I think, sometimes want to feel like we can control that. Certainly during the pandemic, we saw people have differing beliefs, and like wanting, doesn't matter what side you were on, wanting to convince the other person that their information about vaccinations or masks was wrong, and that your information about masks and vaccinations was correct. And and obviously we saw people just dig their heels in, and it didn't matter what side they were on politically. It was really just one of those things that proved that we will not change our minds until we're ready to change our minds. And nobody can necessarily give you that information. When the day that you stumble upon it yourself and something clicks for you, that's the day. Like for me, the letter from the Birmingham jail, I mean, something clicked in my brain, and I started to see something I had never seen before. So I guess it's a lot about patience, it's a lot about love, and a lot about hope, and continuing to try to have these conversations, and knowing that it's hard and you're going to fail, because I do. I mean, it's really easy for me to tell you how to have a conversation, but when I'm faced with it and it's someone very close to me, I'm just as challenged as anyone else, reverting back to the old debate and argue or whatever. So patience, love, and hope.
Yeah. Wow. Those are, yeah, I love that. Great virtues to be clinging on to in these types of conversations, for sure. So I really appreciate you saying that. And although I'm bummed to hear you say that I can't control another person and what they think, such a bummer. But yeah, I think something else that I've heard throughout our conversation this morning is just the need to get curious and how curiosity can truly be a springboard for new and deeper discovery. And I think, I think that, I don't know, that's a great challenge to me personally. Because even as I find myself in this kind of peace and justice work where, we are in the work of bridging divides and very much wanting to work with divided communities. I find myself, gravitating towards people who see things similarly. And so I think, just personally, and I'm sure for those who are listening, it's such a great and challenging encouragement to get curious and, with that, be uncomfortable, and to, I don't know, I wonder if you have any suggestions around, do you intentionally seek out friends and, I don't know, just potential future relationships that, who maybe see things from a different perspective? Or, I mean, I don't know.
Right. Well, I think it's more about not shying away from the people that cross your path. It's I mean, I'm sure there are, like with Braver Angels, ways to intentionally connect with people that hold different political beliefs. So there's ways to be intentional, just like Peace Catalyst is intentional about bringing Muslims and Christians together. And then there's ways that, like I said, just don't shy away from that person that crosses your path that has different opinions, whether it's someone you're sitting next to in the, the nail salon having a pedicure, and practice that curiosity of asking more questions, doing more listening than more, sharing your own thoughts. And I don't know, I just think that anytime we talk to each other as humans, there's always a better chance that we're going to walk away feeling less, what is the word, triggered by each other and by each other's beliefs. And like, again, that's why organizations exist that bring people together, whether it's interfaith dialogue or political interfaith dialogue.
Right.
That's because there's such great value in it. And it's that moment when we stop talking to each other that we start to build a case for being violent with each other, whether it's verbally violent or physically violent. And pretty soon you have, some form of civil war. And that's, I think, what we really have to be on guard about right now in our country.
Right.
We really have to do everything we can, even if it's just being civil to your neighbor. Because we don't want that. That's so unnecessary.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that response. I think maybe just as a final question for me, and then anything else you want to add is very much welcome. So I love that you brought up Martin Luther King in this interview, because our series is around the beloved community, and which, that concept is very much rooted in the civil rights movement. So we are just talking about how we join in this ministry of reconciliation, as people of faith, but, our listeners are all types of individuals coming from all different theological, religious, political perspectives. But so I guess I'm wondering, from with your work and expertise and within the community that you are attached to, how does that, how do those words, beloved community, hit you? And how is it that you currently are, and that you can capture people within your community and context and contribute to changing the status quo around political division or,
Yeah. Well, one thing about Martin Luther King Jr. and people like him is that they can take a term like beloved community and cast a vision, and it's a vision, really. It's a aspiration, and it's very inspiring as such. And I think really great leaders like him also are able to take that vision and start working a mission around it and actually getting some things done. And he, definitely did that in terms of organizing, uh, teaching people nonviolent protest, and just the letters and the teachings and the speeches that he gave. I think it's always good to have a vision and then figure out what piece of that mission are you really capable of at this point in your life, with your time capacity or the talents that you have, and just finding a small niche if that's all you have time for. I remember a while back I worked for the Global Immersion Project, and we took people across the border to learn about, immigration. And as a peace training organization, one of the things that we wanted to do was to help people immerse in their own neighborhoods and figure out where they fit in. So one of my favorite stories, and I'll just end on this note, is that one woman, she lived in a fancy condo project in California, but from her window across the street, she saw this woman pull up during the day. She was clearly Latina, and open her trunk and sell tamales out of the back of her trunk to people passing by. And ordinarily, she would have completely ignored that. But having been on an immersion trip, having eaten tamales made by immigrants, having experienced what can happen when you just reach out and make yourself available, she walked across the street. She bought tamales. She met this woman and started a friendship. That is, to me, the essence right there of peacemaking. Immerse yourself in your surroundings. Stop ignoring the other. And if that other happens to be a political opposite and you have time to go talk to them about their views on something and find out, like Benjamin asked me, do you think there's anything we could agree on politically? And we actually found something. Hey, you've done your part. You really have. So I think that's the essence of peacemaking.
Wow. I love that. I love that final story. Yeah. Seeing the other and not shying away from the opportunity. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Julie. I know I'm leaving with a lot from this conversation, and just, walking away with, if I can keep love, if I can keep hope, and if I can keep patience at the front of my mind, in my next conversation, that'll be a great start, I think. So thank you so much.
That's great, Allie. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, that was such an amazing conversation. I feel like I'm learning so much from Julie and all of her practical tips and tools and advice that she gave is just, it's so inspiring. And I think it's especially relevant for all of us right now in the context and the moments, cultural moment and political moment, social moment that we're all living in. So really, really grateful for her and the example that she's kind of setting for us in a very practical way.
Yeah. I totally agree. I just admire how all of this began for her. It, very much began with a relationship, with a friendship. And I think her being open to examining kind of a new or just a different perspective, or just being open, I guess, like kind of being someone with a posture of who's willing to be taught, who's like very teachable. I don't know. That's what comes to mind when I think about like what set her off on this path. And yeah, so I've also kind of been reflecting on the tools that she recommends, and also just the wanting to kind of emulate the posture that she carried, which was just kind of like a general openness, which is I feel like something that we talk about a lot on this podcast, is like a posture of, you know, being, of willingness, openness, humility. So it might sound like I'm kind of a broken record with that, but yeah, definitely stands out.
Yeah, totally. I think that's such a good point. And I think, I love what she kind of was encouraging us to do, which is like this idea of practicing curiosity and staying curious. And I think, like you're saying, that kind of does put you in a position then to learn something different or something new that maybe you weren't or wouldn't be open to if you're just kind of thinking of like, wait, how am I going to respond or argue my point in this conversation? Or how am I going to make sure that like I get my point across? But if we stay curious and we're willing to learn from those who are different from us, then I think we really can foster relationships with people who do think and believe differently from us, and in a way that's not going to bring division when we disagree, because we've taken the time to sort of, work on the relationship and also find maybe some shared values, like Julie mentioned, with people who have different ideas about how to like achieve those values, but that still at the end of the day, like have a similar, like heart or desire for issues in our world today.
Yeah, listening for the values. I think that's such a practical piece of advice that is definitely difficult in the moment, because I think we automatically turn to what am I gonna say back as a retort, or I think we're already like, or I guess I shouldn't say we. I should just speak for myself here and say I'm usually thinking about, what's the argument that I'm going to fire back. But to actually take a step back and to really try to listen to what they are communicating, and not even just the words that they're saying, but like what's fueling or motivating the words that they're saying. Like, what are those values that are informing the thoughts and the beliefs that they hold ultimately. Yeah, I mean, man, what a practical yet challenging encouragement from Julie.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think, there's definitely, I appreciate how she's also like, it's okay to like take a step back and like breathe, and maybe you can't always engage in every conversation, and I think that's okay too. It's important to respect like our boundaries, and if we're getting triggered by something, like it's okay to take a step back. But at the end of the day, I do think there's something really important about what she's saying. And I especially loved like what she was saying about not shying away from someone who has a different opinion from you, because I do think that's can be the tendency. And going off of that too, because I know she mentioned like, oh, someone that's like sitting next to you in the nail salon, or like someone at a coffee shop, like maybe you overhear something, and to not just move towards like judgment or like criticism, which can ultimately lead to like dehumanizing someone, right? But being willing to like practice that curiosity in that moment. And and I like what she was saying about like asking more questions, like doing more listening, going deeper, trying to get to the bottom, like you're saying, like understanding what is behind what someone's sharing, like what they think about something, what is the underlying value, or what is the underlying like passion point for them, or whatever it may be. Being willing to to be curious and ask them why and ask them how they came to think that way. And yeah, and I think that's so beautiful because then you might get to hear someone's story, which there may be points of connection that you didn't realize, and you could actually build a friendship or relationship with someone. So
Right.
that was really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about or applying what she said to face-to-face interactions, or at least I feel like that's how I've interpreted what we're talking about. I'm curious about your thoughts on like when we are not face-to-face with someone. She spoke about media and tech and how, you know, in the early 2000s and today, media and you know, the internet and social media specifically has really shaped conversations that we have, and divisiveness and polarization, and that's not I don't think that's something that's really debated. I think it's just kind of an accepted truth these days. But yeah, I'm curious how, like, what that's looked like for you. Do you fall for it at all? Like, is it easier to kind of to almost dehumanize might be too strong a word, but to forget the humanity of someone that you're speaking to over some sort of social media platform, or you're engaging with their content and you're not actually seeing them? Like, is it, I don't know, is there do you see it being more challenging to kind of apply Julie's practical tools to that context, or is it, I don't know. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important concept, because obviously most of our fiery interactions do take place online and not actually in person. It's usually because I think in person we're more willing to become, well, I think on the one hand we're more willing to listen in person, but we might also be more willing to be passive and not be as direct, for example, on social media about what we think about something. And social media is a platform for activism, advocacy, sharing what you think, that is a reality. And I think, I mean, it's crazy, because I don't want to say that, this is all social media's fault, that there's division or conflict, or that these sort of relational dynamics wouldn't exist without social media, but they might look different. But I do think there's something to how we communicate on social media, and if that is the best place to share all of our thoughts about everything, or, in such a direct way, or if it's better to try to pursue those conversations only, over Zoom or in person. It's hard.
It is. It sure is. I feel like it definitely requires a certain level of discernment, and across all contexts, not just engaging over the internet or social media, but just discernment, knowing when to engage and how to engage with a person who is of a different political opinion. It requires practice, I think, too.
Yeah, that's so true. It definitely requires, and I think, honestly, a lot of my friends, at least that I'm talking to, are really tired of social media. They're tired of all these different dynamics of virtue signaling and posturing and making sure you're always saying the right thing, and cancel culture. And not that I do believe that there's power in social media activism and advocacy, but that's not the full picture of what it looks like to engage in, peace building or social justice or whatever, issues that people are passionate about, and so, I think there's a lot of disillusionment with social media as a platform for engaging in conversations like this, and how can we like maybe come back to a place of relational development on various topics affecting us. I don't know if you're seeing that too, but
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I echo the fatigue of what social media looks like today, and proper etiquette. And yeah, just, I feel like there's just so much distrust in general, knowing, trying to figure out whether you can even trust what somebody is saying and like stating that they believe, or do you actually think this way? Like, I don't know. Are you just, is this more performative? And so, yeah. So I think reflecting back on our conversation with Julie, perhaps it is from those close friendships, like her friendship with her neighbor. I mean, I don't think we can only build understanding and connection with people that we're close with, but I do think that if there's not a certain level of trust or familiarity, it maybe just complicates a bit.
yeah, that's so true. I think it's like, yeah, it's really hard if you don't already have a relationship with someone and you're just seeing what they post on social media. Yeah, that definitely does not, I don't think that tills the soil for fruitful relationship. So maybe a part of it, and maybe part of that practicing curiosity could be reaching out to someone privately and saying, hey, I saw you posted this, wanted to ask you more about that. Could we maybe talk sometime? Like I'm just curious to learn more about like how you came to think that, or if you'd be willing to, I like what Julie said too, like asking permission, like, okay, would you like for me, or would you be willing to hear me share what I think now? And like engaging in dialogue that way, which I think could work. I mean, I think there's something to a genuine outreach of coming in the name of peace and wanting to understand more, So yeah, I think there's something to that.
And not being something that she also said, not being scared to engage, because it's just so easy to scroll away, and even in face-to-face interactions to shut down, or to fight back, but yeah, not to be afraid to engage in a way that's probably a bit harder, but will lead to much richer outcomes ultimately.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. For more info about Peace Catalyst and to help support our peacebuilding work, please visit our website at peacecatalyst.org.